Chapter 1. The Coastline That Lied About Its Length. Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives. Tonight we're heading to a country where the coastline is so absurdly complicated that geographers still argue about how long it actually is, and depending on how you measure it, the answer ranges from around 2,500 kilometers to well over 100,000. That's not a typo, and it's not a rounding error. That's Norway. And it turns out that when you ask this country a simple question like, "How long is your coast?" the honest answer is a shrug, followed by roughly 2.5 trips around the entire equator's worth of jagged, fjord-riddled shoreline. So yes, Norway is going to be a strange one tonight, in the best possible way. If you're new here, welcome. This channel does long, slow, detailed histories and geographies of countries around the world, written specifically to help you drift off to sleep. No jump scares, no shouting, just a calm voice walking you through a very long and very true story. So go ahead and get comfortable, dim the lights, put the phone down on the nightstand, and settle in for a while. If you'd like, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from tonight. I read everyone, and it's genuinely one of my favourite parts of making these. And if this is your first time here, consider subscribing, because there's a whole planet left to get through. Tonight, we start where every country starts, the ground itself, long before anyone was around to name it. Before there were kings, before there were Vikings, before there was oil, there was just ice doing something genuinely absurd to a very unlucky, very beautiful piece of land. Let's get into it. Picture yourself standing at the very top of Norway, somewhere above the Arctic town of Alta, looking south. If you could see the whole country laid out in one straight line, you'd be looking at very nearly 1,800 kilometers of rock, ice, forest, and water roughly the distance from London down into the middle of the Sahara, except turned on its side and stuffed almost entirely with mountains. Now turn around and look at the coast instead. That's where things really go wrong. In the most spectacular way possible, Norway's coastline doesn't so much follow the sea as argue with it, twisting into thousands of narrow inlets, folding back on itself, wrapping around islands that don't even show up on most maps. Because there are, frankly, too many of them to bother drawing. And that, weirdly enough, is exactly where we have to start this story. Not with kings, not with longships, with rock and an unreasonable amount of ice. Here's the first genuinely absurd fact about this country, and we're barely a minute in. Ask a geographer how long Norway's coastline is, and you will not get a straight answer, because the honest answer is, it depends how patient you are. Measured simply, in one smooth sweep that ignores the details, the coast comes out to roughly 2,500 kilometers, measured properly tracing every fjord, every inlet, every one of the roughly 300,000 islands and skerries scattered along the water. That number explodes to somewhere north of 100,000 kilometers. That is not a rounding error. That is the difference between driving from Oslo to Rome and driving around the entire planet 2.5 times over. Only one country on Earth, Canada, manages a longer coastline than that. So if a Norwegian ever seems a little too relaxed about geography homework, in fairness, their homeland refuses to sit still long enough to be measured. The reason the coast is such a glorious mess is the same reason the interior looks like a losing argument with gravity. Mountains, an enormous amount of them, running down the spine of the country like a badly healed scar. This is the Scandinavian mountain range, and it does not do gentle. Norway has roughly 291 separate peaks above 2,000 meters. The tallest of them, Galdhøpiggen, topping out around 2,469 metres tall enough to hold snow clear through summer, in a country that was never exactly famous for its tan lines. Between the peaks sit high, wind-scoured plateaus like Hardangervidda, one of the largest mountain plateaus in Europe, a place so bleak and treeless that explorers have genuinely used it to train for actual Antarctic expeditions, which tells you everything you need to know. When your backyard doubles as astronaut-adjacent training ground for the South Pole, you are not, statistically speaking, living in the flat part of the map. All that rock has to come from somewhere, and unfortunately for Norwegian farmers throughout history, it came from almost everywhere that wasn't currently growing food. Only about 3% of Norway's total land is arable. 2/3 of the country is tundra, bare stone, or permanent snow and ice. Another quarter is forest. Add that up, and you're left with a sliver, a genuinely stingy sliver of usable farmland, squeezed into river valleys, narrow coastal shelves, and the flatter ground around what's now Oslo, which means for most of Norwegian history, if you wanted to grow food, you didn't get to pick a nice open field and call it a day. You got whatever crooked, half-decent patch of dirt the glaciers happened to leave lying around, and you were grateful for it. This is not a country that rewards farming ambition. It rewards farming wherever gravity briefly lets something flat happen. So let's actually talk about the glaciers, because they're the ones responsible for all of it. The mountains, the missing farmland, and especially the fjords, which are the single feature most people picture the instant you say the word Norway. Here's the process, and it is a slow one. Roughly 2.5 million years of repeated ice ages sent enormous glaciers grinding down existing river valleys, and unlike water, ice does not politely follow the path of least resistance. It bulldozes. These glaciers, some of them kilometres thick, scoured the bedrock beneath them, deepening and widening ordinary valleys into dramatic U-shapes that cut well below sea level. Then, starting around 10,000 years ago, the climate warmed, the ice retreated, and the sea did what the sea always does the moment it's given an opening. It flooded in. What was left behind wasn't a valley anymore. It was a fjord. And by the time the ice finished retreating, Norway had ended up with more than 1,000 of them. The biggest of these is the Sognefjord, and it's worth sitting with the numbers for a second, because they don't entirely feel real. It stretches about 205 kilometres inland from the open coast, further than the distance from New York City to Washington, D.C., and at its deepest point, near the town of Høyanger, it plunges to roughly 1,308 metres. For comparison, that's deeper than most of the North Sea, and deeper than 2.5 Burj Khalifa stacked on top of each other. If you took the tallest building on the planet, flipped it upside down, and dropped it into the water, the Hardangerfjord isn't far behind, running 179 kilometres inland with a depth over 860 metres. These are not just pretty inlets for tourist photographs, they're essentially inland seas carved by ice, and for most of human history in this region, they were also the only sensible way to get anywhere. And that detail matters more than it might sound like it should. Building roads through 291 mountains, across bogs, and around cliffs that drop straight into freezing water was for most of Norwegian history simply not on the table. So people used boats instead. The fjords became the highways, the trade routes, the school run, the entire transportation network, centuries before anyone got around to paving anything. Communities clustered on narrow ledges of farmable land right at the water's edge, close enough to fish, close enough to row somewhere else if the neighbours got difficult. But here's the catch. A boat is wonderful for moving along a fjord and almost entirely useless for climbing the mountain wall directly behind your house. which meant villages only a few kilometres apart, as measured by a very tired crow, could end up cut off from each other for generations at a stretch. Norway still has an extraordinary number of distinct regional dialects today, some of them barely mutually intelligible, and geography is almost entirely to blame. Even now, with roads and tunnels and, frankly, a suspicious number of bridges, Norway remains one of the most sparsely populated countries in Europe, somewhere around 15 people per square kilometre, compared to well over 100 for the European average. Picture your least crowded local park. Now imagine that's most of the country, most of the time. It isn't that Norwegians don't care for company. It's that the land genuinely does not offer very many places to put a town. Oslo and the flatter southeast ended up absorbing most of the population for exactly that reason. It's one of the only regions generous enough to let a city actually sprawl, instead of clinging sideways to a cliff. Now here's the part of Norwegian geography that should make no sense at all, and yet somehow does. Norway sits at a latitude that almost anywhere else on the planet would mean permanent ice. Other places along that same line of latitude include the frozen interior of Alaska and stretches of Siberia that spend most of the year looking like the inside of a chest freezer. Norway, instead, has ice-free ports along most of its coastline, even north of the Arctic Circle, and a fishing industry that's been thriving there for centuries. The reason is the Gulf Stream, or more precisely, its northern extension, the Norwegian Current, which drags something like 4 to 5 million tons of warmed water past the coast every single second. That is an ocean-sized space heater, running on autopilot for an entire nation. Without it, a city like Tromsø, the third largest settlement north of the Arctic Circle, would very likely be an uninhabitable ice shelf instead of a functioning city with cafes, a university, and traffic jams. Norway, essentially, got extremely lucky with the plumbing. That warmth isn't spread evenly though, and the mountains are, once again, the ones rearranging the furniture. Western Norway takes the full force of the Atlantic head-on, which means a mild, wet, marine climate, gentle winters, cool summers, and rain that shows up with almost insulting regularity, dumping over 2,000 millimetres a year in some spots, making it one of the soggier corners of Europe. Cross the mountain spine into the east, though, sheltered in the resulting rain shadow, and the whole weather system flips. Colder winters, warmer summers, and barely a third of the rainfall. Oslo, tucked into that eastern shelter, gets an actual proper summer most years, while towns on the western coast are still checking the forecast for the 4th straight week of drizzle. Same country, roughly the same latitude, a completely different relationship with an umbrella. Head north long enough and you'll physically cross the Arctic Circle, which in Norway isn't some abstract line tucked away in an atlas, there's an actual monument for it, sitting beside the highway near Saltfjellet, so travellers can pull over and take a photo straddling the invisible boundary between the ordinary world and the part of the planet where the sun starts behaving very strangely. Past that line, day and night stop working the way you're used to, and if you've never experienced it firsthand, the sun stops behaving normally, undersells it more than a little. It isn't really a change in the weather forecast, it's a change in the rules of the universe. Take the Lofoten Islands, sitting about 200 kilometres north of that Arctic Circle marker, jagged peaks that shoot straight up out of the sea, as if the landscape genuinely couldn't be bothered to build a coastline first. From roughly late May through the middle of July, the sun over Lofoten simply does not set, not dims, not lingers near the horizon for dramatic effect, does not set for nearly 2 months straight, which means you could, in theory, go for a hike at 2 in the morning under full daylight, assuming your sleep schedule had already given up on you entirely. Flip the calendar to early December, and the opposite kicks in. The polar night arrives, and the sun doesn't rise at all for roughly a month, from the start of December into the first days of January. It isn't pitch black the entire stretch. To be fair, there's a soft blue twilight around midday that Norwegians have their own word for, but it is, unmistakably, a place where the sky has quietly stopped cooperating with your watch. Further north still sits North Cape, a dramatic cliff marketed for generations as the northernmost point of mainland Europe, which isn't quite true, since a nearby headland called Knivskjelodden actually pokes out slightly further north still. Knivskjelodden, however, doesn't have a gift shop, a parking lot, or several centuries of tourist momentum behind it, so North Cape gets the postcards, the crowds, and the sunset photos. Sometimes geography loses to marketing. Apparently it happens even to entire continents. One more thing worth knowing before we move on. If Norway looks enormous on a standard world map, sprawling and oversized next to countries you know for a fact are bigger, that's not really Norway's fault, it's the maps. Most world maps use a projection that stretches everything near the poles, and Norway, sitting way up at a high latitude, gets inflated right along with it. On paper, it can look like a giant. In reality, its actual landmass comes to only around 304,000 square kilometres, roughly comparable to Germany, while holding a tiny fraction of Germany's population, because, again, most of that space is a mountain that would genuinely prefer you leave. So that's the stage. A country stretched thin along nearly 1,800 kilometres of coastline, wrapped in more islands than anyone's ever bothered to finish counting, carved by ice into fjords deep enough to swallow skyscrapers whole, kept just barely livable by a remarkably lucky ocean current, and split straight down the middle by a mountain range that seems to actively resent human settlement. If you were a farmer here 1,000 years ago, life was narrow, hard, and frequently cut off from your nearest neighbours by a wall of granite. But if you were willing to get into a boat instead, well, that's a very different story. Because a people this boxed in by mountains and this comfortable on the water were eventually going to do something about it. And what they did about it is going to take up most of the rest of this series. Chapter 2. The Neighbours Nobody Invited. So, what did they do about it? Picture the 8th of June, 793. On a tidal island off the northeast coast of England sits a monastery called Lindisfarne, rich, undefended, and stuffed with the kind of gold, silver, and manuscripts that monasteries tended to collect back when security system meant a wooden door and a strongly worded prayer. The monks there had heard rumours of raiders before. What they hadn't considered, not for 1 second, was that anyone might come at them from the sea. A scholar named Alcuin, writing in horror afterward, said as much himself. Nobody imagined an attack like this was even possible. And then it happened anyway. Boats sliding out of the fog with men who had absolutely no interest in your prayer schedule, and by the time they left, the monastery was burning, the monks were dead or enslaved, and Christian Europe had just met Norway. Historians now mark that single ugly morning as the traditional start of the Viking Age, which is a slightly odd thing to build a tourist industry around, and yet here we are. Now, the obvious question is how a handful of farmers from a country that was, as we just spent an entire chapter establishing, mostly vertical rock, managed to show up unannounced on the opposite side of the North Sea and ruin everyone's morning. The answer is the longship, and it deserves a moment of genuine respect because it is one of the great engineering flexes of the early medieval world. Norwegian shipbuilders built these things clinker-style overlapping oak planks riveted together with iron, caulked with tarred wool, which sounds fussy until you realise what it bought them: flexibility. The hull could actually twist and flex in rough seas instead of snapping, the way a diving board bends instead of breaking. Under sail, a longship could hit speeds that would still be respectable for a modern sailboat, and the draft, the depth of hull sitting below the waterline was often under a metre, which meant these ships could cross an open, genuinely terrifying ocean and then, without slowing down, glide straight up a river or right onto a beach that had never once considered itself a potential front door. Nothing else in Europe could do both. That's not a raiding advantage, that's a monopoly. Here's the detail that actually explains the whole shape of the Viking Age, and it loops right back to the geography we just spent chapter 1 on. Running down the spine of Scandinavia is that same mountain range Norwegians call part of it the Keel, and it doesn't just carve up Norway internally, it splits the entire peninsula into two countries that are, functionally, facing opposite directions. Norway looks west, out across open Atlantic water, towards Scotland, Ireland, and a North Sea that's honestly more of a very large lake if you've got the right boat. Sweden looks east toward the Baltic and the river systems that unspool deep into what's now Russia. So while Swedish Vikings were rowing down rivers to trade and occasionally pillage their way toward Constantinople, becoming the ancestors of a state literally named after them, the Rus, Norwegian Vikings were doing almost the exact opposite trip, in almost the exact opposite direction, for the exact same reason. Same mountains, same shortage of farmland, same boats, different ocean. And landing in Scotland, Ireland or England wasn't a one-time smash and grab. It became a pattern, then a habit, then basically a commute. Norwegian raiders hit the Shetlands and Orkneys so early and so thoroughly that both island groups ended up functionally Norwegian for centuries, complete with their own dialect of Old Norse that survived into the 18th century. They took the Hebrides, they sailed up Irish rivers, and founded what would eventually become Dublin. Yes, that Dublin. Started as a Viking long fort, a fortified ship camp, which is a slightly embarrassing origin story for a European capital, and Dublin has, understandably, mostly stopped bringing it up. Some of these Norwegians kept raiding indefinitely. Most, eventually, didn't. Which brings up a point worth making early. Viking wasn't originally a nationality, or even a full-time job. It was a verb. Going a Viking meant going on a raiding expedition, usually seasonal, usually a young man's activity squeezed in between planting and harvest. The overwhelming majority of Norwegians in this period never went a Viking even once. They were farmers, fishermen and traders who happened to share a coastline with some extremely motivated part-time pirates. Back home, meanwhile, Norway itself was still a patchwork of small, squabbling kingdoms, which if you were paying attention to that mountain and fjord geography should surprise nobody. Hard to run one unified country when every valley is its own isolated pocket with a boat instead of a road. That started changing around the year 872. Traditionally, when a king named Harald Fairhair defeated a coalition of rival chieftains at the Battle of Hafrsfjord, near what's now the city of Stavanger, and declared himself the first king of a unified Norway. Historians today think the real unification was messier and slower than one tidy battle these things usually are, but the story stuck because it's a good one, and because it explains what happened next rather beautifully. A lot of the chieftains who lost at Hafrsfjord weren't thrilled about suddenly having a boss. Some of them did what any reasonable person with access to a longship and 0 remaining local options would do. They left. And conveniently there happened to be a large, empty, green-looking island sitting out in the North Atlantic with absolutely nobody's name on it yet. That island was Iceland, and its most famous first settler was a chieftain named Ingolfr Arnason, who arrived around 874. According to the sagas, Ingolfr threw the carved wooden pillars from his high seat, basically his household ceremonial throne posts, overboard as he approached the coast, and vowed to settle wherever the gods decided to wash them ashore. It took his men a few years of searching to actually find the pillars again, which is either a testament to divine patience or a very slow way to pick real estate. He eventually settled at a bay where steam was rising off the ground from natural hot springs and named it Reykjavik Smoky Bay. It is now the capital of Iceland, home to roughly 2/3 of the country's population, and it owes its name to volcanic plumbing that a Viking mistook for smoke. Honestly, still one of the more accurate city names in Europe. Now here's the detail that genuinely surprised researchers when the genetics finally came in, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Modern DNA studies of early Icelandic settlers show something like a roughly even split at the start between Norse ancestry and Gaelic ancestry, Irish and Scottish. And that split wasn't romantic. Norwegian raiders had spent decades hitting Ireland and Scotland before Iceland was ever settled, and a great many of the women who ended up in those founding Icelandic households arrived not as willing colonists but as captives, taken from exactly the coastlines those longships had been terrorizing. Over the following centuries, the population's ancestry gradually shifted to be far more heavily Norse, which researchers think happened because settlers of Norwegian background simply had more surviving children. So if you ever meet someone from Iceland today, there is a genuinely decent chance their family tree runs directly back through both a Norwegian farmer and an Irish woman who did not get a say in the matter. History doesn't clean up after itself. It just quietly waits for a DNA lab to show up 1,000 years later. If Iceland was the promising real estate, Greenland was the con job, and its founder deserves some kind of dishonourable marketing award. A man named Erik the Red got exiled from Norway for manslaughter, resettled in Iceland, and then got exiled from Iceland too, for killing yet another neighbour in a dispute, because apparently moving countries doesn't automatically fix your temper. Banished for 3 years, he sailed further west and found a genuinely enormous landmass, mostly buried under ice, with a few grassy fjords clinging to its southwestern edge. He named the whole thing Greenland. On purpose, because as the old sagas bluntly put it, he figured people would be more willing to move somewhere with a nice name. It worked. He went back to Iceland, recruited a wave of settlers, and by the year 985, Norse Greenland existed a real estate scam so effective it founded an actual colony. That colony lasted for centuries, farming, raising sheep and trading walrus ivory back to Europe, before it eventually vanished, swallowed by a cooling climate, crushed isolation as sea ice made the supply route from Norway less and less reliable, and pressure from the environment that a small Norse population just couldn't outlast. By some point in the 15th century, the last of Norse Greenland was gone, and nobody in Europe even noticed for a while, which is a genuinely eerie way for an entire settlement to end, not with a battle or a headline, just silence, and a slow, cold fade nobody was watching closely enough to record. But before any of that decline, Erik's son gave Norway its single most staggering footnote in the entire Viking story. Leif Erikson, sailing west from Greenland around the year 1000, made landfall on the actual coast of North America nearly 500 years before Columbus ever left port. He called the land Vinland for the wild grapes his crew reportedly found growing there, and for a brief window, Norse settlers actually lived on North American soil, farming and building turf longhouses on what's now the coast of Newfoundland, and then it fell apart. Leif's brother led a follow-up expedition, and things went badly with the local population. The sagas called Skraeling's trade attempts curdled into violent clashes. The Norse were badly outnumbered, and with no realistic way to send reinforcements across an entire ocean, the settlement was abandoned. North America had already met Europe. Europe just wasn't paying attention yet, and wouldn't be for another 5 centuries. Not every westward Norwegian story ends in retreat, though. A chieftain named Rollo, likely Norwegian by birth, though the sagas argue about it the way relatives argue about anything after a few generations spent years raiding up the Seine into France, until the French king finally did the thing exhausted kings eventually do. He paid the problem to become a solution. In 911, Rollo was granted a chunk of northern France in exchange for defending it from other raiders, and that territory became Normandy literally, land of the Northmen. His descendants intermarried into French nobility, dropped the Old Norse, picked up French, and a few generations later, one of them, William, Duke of Normandy, sailed the other direction across the Channel and conquered England outright in 1066. So somewhere in the blood of English royalty, quietly, sits a Norwegian. Back home, most of this was happening on the margins of a much quieter, much less cinematic life. Norwegian society split roughly into 3 tiers. Jarls at the top, wealthy, and often the ones bankrolling raiding expeditions. Carls in the middle, free farmers and craftsmen who made up the bulk of the population. And thralls at the bottom, enslaved people, some captured abroad, whose unpaid labour quietly propped the whole system up. Women, by the standards of the era, had a surprising amount of legal standing. They could own property, request a divorce, and run a farm independently while their husbands were off raiding, trading, or occasionally not coming back at all. And trade, frankly, mattered more to the actual Norwegian economy than raiding ever did. Ships went out loaded with furs, walrus, ivory, and dried fish, and came home with silver, including, oddly, counterfeit Arab coins that had travelled an almost unbelievable distance to end up buried in a Norwegian field. Raiding got the headlines. Farming, fishing, and quietly profitable trade routes were what actually kept the lights on. So that's the Viking Age, or at least the version of it that actually happened, as opposed to the one with horned helmets, which for the record nobody wore, ever. That was a 19th century costume designer's invention, and it has simply refused to die. What really happened was stranger and, honestly, more impressive. Farmers from a country with almost no farmland built the best ships in the known world, used them to become the most feared and most well-travelled people in Europe, founded a nation on volcanic rock, tried and failed to colonize a continent, and accidentally left a Norwegian fingerprint on the English throne itself. And through all of it, back in the fjords, something else was quietly changing. New ideas were arriving on those same ships, carried home from Ireland, from England, from monasteries that had learned, the hard way, exactly who their neighbours were. A god was coming to replace the old ones, and he was going to change absolutely everything about how Norway was run. Chapter 3. The Saint Who Got Murdered into Sainthood. A god was coming to replace the old ones, and he was going to change absolutely everything about how Norway was run. His name was Christ, and his first Norwegian salesman was a king called Håkon the Good. And if you're picturing a triumphant religious revolution, recalibrate, because this attempt went about as well as most first drafts go. Håkon had grown up as a foster child at the English court of King Aethelstan, which is a very polite way of saying he was a political hostage raised in a nice house. He came home a genuinely devout Christian and a genuinely careful politician, and for a while he tried to have it both ways, quietly worshipping his own god while letting everyone else keep theirs. Then he got invited to a pagan blot, one of the big seasonal feasts where you toast the old gods and eat the ceremonial meat, and the crowd made it very clear that attendance was not optional, and neither was the horse liver. Håkon ate the horse liver. He toasted Odin. He kept his throne and lost the argument, and Christianity in Norway went back to being a rumour from overseas. Which brings us to the man who actually got the job done, a former Viking raider named Olaf Tryggvason, and got the job done is doing some very heavy lifting in that sentence. Olaf was Harald Fairhair's grandson, which meant he had a claim to the throne and absolutely no patience for waiting his turn. Legend says he converted after a seer on England's Isles of Scilly correctly predicted his future, which is either divine intervention or an extremely good cold read. History doesn't say. Either way, Olaf came home in 995 with a new religion and the subtlety of a wrecking ball. He founded a town at the mouth of the Nid River and called it Nidaros, you know it today as Trondheim, and turned it into his personal headquarters for a very aggressive rebranding campaign. Here's what Olaf's version of conversion actually looked like on the ground. He burned pagan temples. He took the sons of skeptical chieftains hostage to guarantee good behaviour. And for the people who still weren't convinced, he offered a very simple choice: baptism, exile, or mutilation. And he was not bluffing about door number 3. This was not a man handing out pamphlets. This was regime change with a cross stapled to the front of it. And it worked, in the narrow sense that it terrified an entire country into church attendance, which turns out to be a genuinely effective strategy right up until the people you terrorize start comparing notes. Olaf didn't get to enjoy his success for long. He died in the year 1000 at the Battle of Svolder, ambushed at sea by a coalition of enemies who'd apparently had enough. So that was his reign. You'd think Norway might take the hint and reconsider the whole forced conversion thing. It did not. Enter Olaf Haraldsson. A different Olaf, no relation, because Norwegian history really was not concerned with your ability to keep names straight. This second Olaf picked up the exact same project to unify Norway, install Christianity, centralise power under one crown, and pursued it with the same missionary zeal and roughly the same allergy to consensus building. He got driven into exile by Knut the Great, the Danish king who at the time also ran England, because apparently Norway's neighbours had started treating it as a timeshare. Olaf came back anyway, gathered what forces he could, and marched to reclaim his throne, which brings us to the moment this whole chapter has been circling. On the 29th of July, 1030, Olaf Haraldsson met a much larger force of his own rebelling countrymen at a place called Stiklestad, and he lost. Badly. He died on that battlefield, cut down by the very nobles who were supposed to answer to him, and by any reasonable measure this should have been the end of the story. A failed king, killed by his own people, buried and forgotten like most failed kings are. Instead, something genuinely strange happened. Within about a year, his body was dug up, and according to the accounts, it hadn't decayed. His hair and nails people swore were still growing. Now, we can debate the biology here. Cold Norwegian soil does a lot of the heavy lifting that miracle usually gets credit for, but nobody at the time was interested in debating biology. The local bishop declared it a sign, and Olaf Haraldsson, who 10 minutes earlier by historical standards had been a deeply unpopular king killed by his own subjects, was canonized as a saint. This is an extremely fast turnaround for sainthood. Most saints wait centuries for the paperwork. Olaf got fast-tracked like he had status with the airline. Pope Alexander III eventually confirmed it officially more than a century later, in 1164, but by then it barely mattered, because the cult of Saint Olaf had already done more for Christianity in Norway than either of his forced conversion campaigns managed. Turns out you can burn down all the temples you want, and people will resent you for it. Get murdered and rumoured to still have fingernail growth, though, and suddenly you're a national icon. They built a cathedral over his grave at Nidaros, and it became, genuinely, one of the great pilgrimage destinations of northern Europe, the Compostela of the fjords, if you like. Pilgrims walked for weeks, sometimes months, to visit the tomb of the eternal king, Rex Perpetuus Norvegiae, as the paperwork eventually styled him. And here's the detail worth sitting with for a second. The two Olafs who tried to force this new religion onto Norway through hostage-taking and mutilation are largely footnotes now. The one who actually made Christianity permanent did it by dying badly at the hands of his own people and then getting a very good publicity campaign afterward. History is occasionally that petty and that random, and there was absolutely nothing anyone alive at the time could have predicted about it. Right, so Christianity had arrived, sort of glued itself to the monarchy, and Norway had a patron saint. Everything was settled and stable and peaceful forever after. Just kidding, it immediately fell into a civil war that lasted, conservatively, about a century. Norwegian succession law at the time had one very specific design flaw. Any son, a king, acknowledged as his own, legitimate or otherwise, had a claim to the throne, and Norwegian kings were not exactly disciplined about who they acknowledged. This is the medieval equivalent of a company with no clear rules about who inherits it, run by a founder with several unofficial side ventures, and you can guess how smoothly that goes. Starting around 1130, rival claimants and rival factions spent generations fighting each other across the country, the two most famous being the Birkebeiners and the Baglers, and yes, Birkebeiner literally translates to birch legs, originally a mocking nickname for a faction so poor they wrapped birch bark around their legs instead of proper boots. The Birkebeiners had the last laugh, mostly thanks to a man named Sverre Sigurdsson, who showed up from the Faroe Islands claiming royal descent, which is a suspiciously convenient thing to claim when you're trying to become king, and somehow made it stick. Sverre took the throne through sheer persistence and battlefield success, and ruled into the early 1200s, founding a dynasty that would eventually end the whole Civil War era. And here's the detail that actually survived into the modern world in 1206, with the Baglers hunting for Sverre's infant grandson. Two Birkebeiner warriors smuggled the baby across the mountains through a howling snowstorm on skis to keep him alive. That baby grew up to become King Håkon the Fourth. And that ski journey is why, to this day, Norway runs an annual 54-kilometre cross-country ski race called the Birkebeinerrennet, in honour of two guys who once skied a future monarch through a blizzard because the alternative was regicide. Håkon the Fourth is where Norway hits its medieval high point, and it's worth actually sitting in this moment, because it does not last. He took the throne as a child born into decades of civil war and somehow reigned for 46 years, longer than any Norwegian king since Harald Fairhair first hammered the country together. Under Håkon, the fighting finally stopped, trade with England and the German ports boomed, Bergen grew into a genuine international hub, and Norway's territory reached its absolute maximum extent: the mainland, Iceland, Greenland, the Faroe Islands, Shetland, Orkney, and for a while the Hebrides and the Isle of Man too. If you'd drawn a map of the Norwegian realm around 1260, you'd have been looking at a North Atlantic empire stretching from the Norwegian mainland clear across to the edge of North America's doorstep. This was, genuinely, as good as it ever got. It did not stay that good. Håkon tried to hold on to the Hebrides by force, fought the Scots at the Battle of Largs in 1263, and then promptly died on Orkney on the way home, which is a spectacularly anticlimactic way to end a 46-year winning streak. His son, Magnus VI, nicknamed the Lawmender, which is the most Scandinavian nickname imaginable, formally handed the Hebrides and the Isle of Man over to Scotland in the Treaty of Perth in 1266. and then did something genuinely impressive. He unified Norway's patchwork of regional laws into a single national legal code, one of the first countries in Europe to pull that off. So Norway traded some far-flung islands for an actual functioning legal system. Not a bad deal, all things considered. The kingdom kept humming along prosperous, Christian, legally coherent, and thoroughly unaware that its worst century was about to arrive by boat. That boat showed up at Bergen in the late summer of 1349, and it deserves to be described exactly as ominously as it actually was. The traditional account has a ship arriving from England, its crew looking healthy enough on approach, and then dying, rapidly and in large numbers, almost as soon as the cargo started coming off the deck. Nobody on the docks knew what they were looking at. Nobody could have known. This was the Black Death, and Bergen, Norway's busiest, wealthiest, most internationally connected port, the very city that Håkon and Magnus had spent a century building into a trade hub, turned out to be the perfect front door for the single deadliest event in the country's history. Historians can actually track its spread with unsettling precision, because of a spike in property deeds, people scrambling to rewrite their wills once they realised what was coming for them. Bergen by September, Oslo by October, Tønsberg by November. It moved faster than anyone could organise a response to it, because there was no response to organise. The numbers, when you actually let them land, are almost impossible to picture. Norway lost somewhere between 60 and 65% of its entire population within a generation, one of the worst mortality rates recorded anywhere in plague-era Europe. Some Icelandic chroniclers, writing about their neighbour across the sea, claimed barely a third of Norwegians were left standing at all. Try to actually picture that ratio for a second, not a statistic, a village. Out of every 10 people you knew, 6 or 7 are simply gone within a year or two, and the ones who survive are burying neighbours, siblings, entire households, with no explanation beyond an angry god or a poisoned well, because germ theory was still 500 years away. This wasn't a bad harvest or a hard winter. This was the floor falling out from under an entire society, with no warning and no mercy. And the damage didn't stop when the dying slowed, because the Black Death didn't just kill people, it dismantled the machinery behind Norway's golden age. The free farmers, the bonde, the backbone of the economy, and its tax base were gutted, and thousands of farms were simply abandoned, left to be quietly reclaimed by forest, some not resettled for generations. The aristocracy, already a fairly thin layer stretched across a big, sparsely populated country, was hit just as hard, and with them went the pool of nobles, clergy, and administrators the crown had always relied on to actually run the place. You cannot operate a kingdom, collect taxes, raise armies, maintain a legal system Magnus the lawmender was so proud of, when the people who did all of that are dead and the farms funding it are empty. The monarchy that had ruled a North Atlantic empire 50 years earlier now barely had the manpower to govern its own mainland. So that's where we leave Norway at the end of this chapter, a kingdom that spent 3 centuries building something remarkable, a national religion forged out of a martyred king, a unified legal code, an empire stretching from the fjords to the edge of Greenland, and then watch most of it get quietly dismantled by a single ship's cargo in the space of about 18 months. The crown was still there. The cathedral at Nidaros was still standing over Saint Olaf's bones. But the country underneath all of it had been hollowed out, its farms empty, its nobility decimated, its tax base in ruins, and a kingdom that weak does not stay independent for very long. Someone else was about to notice. Chapter 4. The 400-Year Night. Someone else was about to notice. That's where we left off, and it didn't take long at all. Denmark noticed first, though in fairness, Denmark had been eyeing Norway's coastline for a while, the way a patient diner eyes a plate that stopped fighting back. But the person actually pulling the strings in this next chapter of Scandinavian history wasn't a king. It was a woman named Margaret, and she is, without exaggeration, one of the most quietly terrifying rulers in medieval Europe, the kind of person who ends up running 3 kingdoms at once and never bothers putting her own face on a single coin. Here's how that happened. Margaret was a Danish princess, married off as a child to the King of Norway in one of those political arrangements that medieval royalty treated as perfectly normal and everyone else would rightly call alarming. Her son inherited both the Danish and Norwegian crowns while he was still a boy, which meant Margaret ran things in his name. Then he died suddenly at 17, and rather than collapse, Margaret simply kept going. Since the law wouldn't technically let a woman rule outright, she took the title Lady and Rightful Ruler instead. Found a 15-year-old great-nephew named Erik to wear the actual crown, and quietly held every real lever of power herself until the day she died. Erik reigned, Margaret ruled. Nobody was confused about the difference. In 1397, at a town called Kalmar in Sweden, Margaret formalised the whole arrangement into what history now calls the Kalmar Union. Denmark, Norway and Sweden, 3 legally separate kingdoms sharing a single monarch, mostly to keep German merchants from the Hanseatic League from swallowing the entire Baltic coast piece by piece. Think of it as 3 companies agreeing to share one CEO because none of them can afford to fight off the same aggressive competitor alone. On paper, each kingdom kept its own laws, its own council, its own identity. In practice, whoever controlled the crown controlled the conversation, and Denmark, being the largest and richest of the 3, controlled the crown. It actually worked, for a while. Margaret died in 1412 of the plague, aboard her own ship, which feels like a uniquely unglamorous way for a woman who'd outmaneuvered half the crowned heads of Europe to go out. History rarely hands out endings that match the resume. Sweden, it turned out, was never entirely on board. Danish appointed nobles kept getting the best jobs and the biggest tax breaks, and Swedish resentment simmered for over a century until a Danish king named Christian II decided the fastest way to handle dissent was to execute somewhere around 80 to 90 Swedish nobles in Stockholm's main square. Over the course of a single bloody week in 1520, it is remembered accurately as the Stockholm bloodbath, and it is a spectacular case study in solving a public relations problem by making it dramatically worse. One of the young noblemen who escaped, Gustav Vasa, spent the next 3 years raising an army out of pure fury. By 1523, Sweden was out of the Union entirely, and Vasa was its king. Norway did not get to leave, and this is the part where Chapter 3's ending comes due. Norway, remember, had just been gutted by the Black Death, its farms empty, its nobility decimated, its tax base in ruins. Sweden could walk away from the Union because Sweden still had the muscle to back up the decision. Norway showed up to that same exit door and found its own legs didn't work anymore. So while Sweden went its own way, Norway stayed locked in with Denmark alone for the next 270-some years, in a relationship that had stopped being a partnership and started being something closer to a landlord situation. Then Denmark decided Norway needed a new religion and asked nobody's opinion on the matter. In 1536 and 1537, King Christian III converted Denmark-Norway to Lutheranism, dissolved Norway's own governing council outright, and folded the country's administration directly into Copenhagen's. Norway's Catholic archbishop fled the country rather than go along with it, and the crown seized the church's land and wealth on the way out the door. Norway technically kept the word kingdom in its name, the way a demoted employee sometimes keeps an old title on their business card. In practice, it now ran as a Danish province with excellent scenery and considerably less say in its own affairs. What followed is the stretch of history Norwegians themselves later nicknamed Fjords, the 400-year night. The playwright Henrik Ibsen popularised the phrase, and it stuck, because it captures the mood better than any date range could. Norway's own nobility gradually died out or drifted off to Copenhagen, chasing better opportunities, until there was barely a native aristocracy left to speak of. Every major decision got made in a Danish capital most Norwegians would never see. Danish became the written and administrative language, even though people kept speaking their own dialects at home. And if you wanted a university education, tough luck. Norway didn't get one of its own until 1811. Before that, ambitious young Norwegians packed a trunk and went to Denmark to learn. But here's the thing about a 400-year night. It turns out you can go quiet without going away. Out in the countryside, far from any Danish administrator's desk, Norway's free farmers kept their land through a legal rite called odelsret, passed down father to son for generations no matter who happened to be issuing the paperwork in Copenhagen. Local dialects survived stubbornly. Old stories from the saga era got passed around firesides instead of printing presses. Folk costumes, folk music, and a deep, quiet stubbornness about who these people actually were kept simmering under the surface the entire time. Norway wasn't erased during those centuries. It was more like a country that had been put on mute while the meeting went on without it. And to be fair to Denmark, Norway wasn't just dead weight during all this, it was genuinely useful, which somehow made the arrangement feel worse rather than better. Norwegian timber built the ships of the Danish-Norwegian Navy, plank by plank, mast by mast. Out of forests Norway had in practically unlimited supply. Norwegian fish and iron kept flowing south, filling Danish warehouses and Danish treasuries in roughly equal measure. Norway was, in effect, the quiet, hard-working partner supplying the raw materials while somebody else's capital city got the palaces, the university, and the parliament. It's the historical equivalent of doing all the unglamorous back-end work at a company while another department gets the office with the good view, the corner desk, and the framed photo in the annual report. That arrangement can hold for a surprisingly long time. It just can't hold forever, especially once the parent company starts making genuinely terrible decisions on the world stage. Which brings us to the Napoleonic Wars and Denmark-Norway's absolutely disastrous run of luck. The kingdom tried to stay neutral. Britain wasn't interested in that plan, because it feared Napoleon might seize the sizable Danish-Norwegian fleet for himself. So in 1807, without much of a formal declaration, the British Navy bombarded Copenhagen and simply took the fleet, a manoeuvre so blunt it's a little astonishing it worked. Denmark-Norway, understandably furious, threw its lot in with Napoleon out of sheer spite as much as strategy. It is rarely a good sign when your foreign policy is driven primarily by revenge. Norway hadn't chosen any of this. Norway was about to pay for it anyway, and the bill came due in the most literal way imaginable. Britain responded by blockading Norway's coastline, and this is where the abstract politics turn into something much harder to sit with. Norway had never grown enough grain to feed itself. The mountains and the short growing seasons saw to that, and for centuries it had quietly relied on shipments from Denmark to fill the gap. The blockade cut that lifeline completely. By 1812 and 1813, Norway was in the grip of what people at the time simply called hungersnoden, the hunger emergency. Picture a farming family rationing what little grain remained, watching the shipping lanes for boats that weren't coming, going through an entire winter unsure whether spring would actually solve anything. That happened up and down the Norwegian coast for 2 straight years because of a war Norway never asked to join. Napoleon lost, as he tends to in these stories, and Denmark-Norway ended up on the losing side of the peace table too. On January 14th, 1814, the Treaty of Kiel settled the bill, and Norway was the currency. Denmark's king handed the entire country over to the King of Sweden, largely to compensate Sweden for territory it had lost elsewhere, in a transaction Norwegians had exactly zero input into. 400 years of being administered from Copenhagen ended with Norway being signed over to Stockholm on a piece of paper in Kiel, the way you might sign away a used couch to cover a debt, without checking whether the couch had opinions about the arrangement. As it turned out, this particular couch had very strong opinions. The man technically in charge on the ground, a Danish crown prince named Christian Frederick, initially wanted to simply declare himself King of Norway by hereditary right and be done with it. A Norwegian professor named Georg Sverdrup talked him out of that plan with an argument that would have sounded like treason a generation earlier. Sovereignty, Sverdrup said, now belonged to the Norwegian people, not to any bloodline. So if Christian Frederick wanted a crown, the Norwegian people would have to actually give him one. That conversation, on February 16th, 1814, is arguably the real starting gun for modern Norway. Within weeks, the country was summoning something it hadn't organised in over 4 centuries, a national assembly of its own. 112 representatives gathered at a manor house in the small town of Eidsvoll starting on April 10th and worked for 5 straight weeks, hammering out a document of 110 articles that borrowed liberally from the American and French constitutions and, in places, went further than either. It curbed royal power, established an elected parliament, and effectively dismantled what little was left of Norway's nobility as a governing class. On May 17, 1814, they signed it and elected Christian Frederick king. That date is still Norway's biggest holiday, celebrated to this day with children's parades, flags, and enormous quantities of ice cream. And notably no tanks or weapons in sight, a national holiday built entirely around a piece of paper, which is, honestly, a fairly Norwegian thing to be proud of. Sweden was, understandably, not thrilled about any of this. Its crown prince, a former Napoleonic marshal named Karl Johan, who had spent the last several years fighting Napoleon into the ground, marched an experienced army into a freshly independent Norway that summer, and the resulting conflict lasted about as long as you'd expect from a hastily assembled Norwegian militia facing down actual battle-tested veterans. A ceasefire called the Convention of Moss ended the fighting on August 14th, with Sweden agreeing to accept Norway's brand new constitution almost entirely intact in exchange for Norway accepting union under the Swedish crown. Christian Frederick abdicated that October, after a grand total of 4 months and 23 days on the throne, and went home to Denmark where, in one of history's tidier bits of irony, he eventually became King of Denmark himself in 1839. That November, the Norwegian Parliament, called the Storting, reconvened, tweaked the constitution just enough to acknowledge the new arrangement, and elected the Swedish king as Norway's monarch. What followed was nothing like the previous 4 centuries. This new union of Sweden and Norway kept Norway's own constitution, its own parliament, its own laws, its own army, and its own capital, sharing with Sweden only a king and, largely, a foreign policy. It was a real union, but a loose one closer to 2 separate households, sharing one very awkward joint bank account than an actual merger. And that looseness turned out to matter enormously, because a country that has just written its own constitution and celebrated its first taste of self-rule does not stay content sharing anything for very long. So Norway entered its 91 years under the Swedish crown carrying something it hadn't had in over 4 centuries, its own government, its own sense of what it was, and a growing, restless awareness of everything it still wasn't. The 400-year night was over. What came next wasn't full daylight yet, not quite more like that stretch just before sunrise where everyone's awake but nobody's officially called it morning. Norway had tasted independence for exactly one spring, and it was not going to forget the flavour. Sweden was about to learn that lesson the hard way, over the following decades, one grinding political standoff at a time. But that story, like most good ones in this house, is going to have to wait. Chapter 5. The Country That Said No Twice. Sweden did, in fact, learn that lesson. Slowly, with the enthusiasm of a man having a tooth removed 1 decade at a time, for most of the 1800s, the union of Sweden and Norway looked, from the outside, like a tidy little arrangement. 2 flags, 1 king, everybody smiling for the portrait. On the inside, it was closer to 2 roommates who technically split the rent, but only one of them ever gets asked to sign for the packages. Norway had its own constitution, parliament and army, and increasingly, its own opinions about all of it. And opinions, as any king eventually discovers, have a nasty habit of turning into constitutional crises if you ignore them long enough. The first real crack showed up in 1884, over something as thrilling as a government resignation, which, stay with me, is a bigger deal than it sounds. King Oscar II's Conservative government had spent years blocking a constitutional amendment. The Storting, Norway's parliament, had already passed 3 times, on the theory that if you ignore a problem long enough it gets bored and leaves. It did not get bored. It put the government on trial in an actual impeachment court and won. The government resigned, the Storting's authority over the executive was cemented, and Norway became the first country in Scandinavia run on genuine parliamentary lines. Sweden clapped politely and did nothing similar for a generation. Norway, meanwhile, had just discovered it could out-argue a king. That is not a skill. You forget you have. From there, the 2 halves of the union kept drifting, the way a couple drifts when one person wants to renovate the kitchen and the other insists the kitchen has always been fine. Norwegian politics tilted liberal and parliamentary. Swedish politics stayed comfortably monarchist, the king still holding real power back home, and underneath it sat a genuinely absurd grievance. Norway, a small mountainous country of barely 2 million people, he had built one of the largest merchant marines on the planet, thousands of ships flying the Norwegian flag into ports on every ocean. Every one of those ships, when it needed a consul to sort out paperwork abroad, had to go through consulates run out of Stockholm, staffed by Sweden, answerable to Sweden. Norway was doing the shipping. Sweden was doing the paperwork. If you've ever worked with someone who CCs themselves into decisions that were never theirs to make, you already understand this argument. By the early 1900s, this had stopped being an annoyance and become the entire relationship. Norway wanted its own consular service. Sweden, through King Oscar, kept saying no, or worse, let's discuss it further, which is diplomatic language for no with extra steps. On the 7th of February 1905, Oscar announced negotiations had collapsed entirely. A new Norwegian government formed the following month with one specific mandate: stop asking permission. In late May, the Storting passed a bill establishing a separate Norwegian consular service outright. Oscar vetoed it, And here Norway's parliament did something almost gleeful in its precision. Instead of simply declaring independence, a straightforward act of rebellion, they announced that because the king had refused to appoint a functioning government, he had effectively stopped being king of Norway. Not treason, just paperwork. Norway hadn't quit the marriage. Technically, on paper, Sweden's king had already walked out of it. That was the 7th of June, 1905, and for a few tense months afterward, nobody quite knew whether this was a bloodless legal manoeuvre or the opening move of an actual war. Troops moved toward the border on both sides. Newspapers on both sides worked themselves into a lather. Here's a detail that rarely makes the highlight reel. A good chunk of the reason Sweden didn't march on Norway wasn't diplomacy at the top. It was pressure from below Swedish workers and the labour movement, who had zero interest in dying so their king could keep a consulate in Bergen, made their objections known, loudly. Sometimes history gets rewritten by kings and generals. Sometimes it gets rewritten by a few 100,000 people saying, politely but firmly, absolutely not. Norway got lucky that so many ordinary Swedes agreed with them. To prove this wasn't just a handful of politicians freelancing, Norway put the decision to its people on the 13th of August, 1905. Every adult male in the country was asked one simple question: dissolve the union, yes or no? 368,208 men voted yes, 184 voted no. Do the math and you land around 99.95% in favour, the kind of margin that, in most modern elections, would trigger 3 separate fraud investigations. It wasn't fraud. It was a country that had spent 91 years quietly rehearsing this exact answer and finally got asked out loud. If you've ever sat in a meeting where everyone secretly agreed but nobody wanted to say it first, imagine that meeting finally happening at national scale, with the vote counted in public. Even with a result that lopsided, you don't get to walk out of a union without negotiating the furniture. So delegations met that August in a Swedish town called Karlstad to hammer out terms. It could have gone badly. Instead, over roughly 3 weeks of talks, both sides worked out a settlement, a demilitarized border zone, a handful of concessions that landed remarkably close to what Norway wanted from the start. By late September, it was official. The union of Sweden and Norway, 91 years old, was dissolved without a single shot fired between the two governments, which frankly is more than can be said for most divorces involving considerably less territory. Here's the part that trips people up. Norway had just spent decades fighting to get out from under somebody else's king, and its very next move, decided by yet another referendum that November, was to go get a king of its own. Not out of habit, a serious Republican movement argued its case, but the majority wanted a monarchy, partly because a royal family handed the new nation instant recognition on a continent that still took crowns seriously. So the Storting offered the throne to a Danish prince named Carl, who accepted, took the deliberately old-fashioned name Håkon as a nod to the medieval kings we covered a few chapters back, and arrived that November with his wife and a 2-year-old son in his arms. Picture it. A brand new nation barely 3 months old, welcoming its first independent king in 500 years, and he's holding a toddler. Not exactly Viking pageantry, but it worked. So Norway had its independence, its king, its own consulates, and a well-earned sense of having handled the whole thing with remarkable dignity. Then World War I arrived and reminded everyone that dignity doesn't stop torpedoes. Norway stayed officially neutral, the way it would try again a generation later, but neutrality doesn't mean invisible, and its enormous merchant fleet was still out on the open ocean, carrying cargo for anyone who'd pay. which made it a target for German U-boats regardless of which flag was flying. Something close to 900 Norwegian ships went down, and 3 pines. More than 1,500 Norwegian sailors died, men who weren't fighting for either side, just trying to get a hold full of fish or timber from one port to the next. Norway earned a nickname during this period, Britain's silent ally, a polite way of saying it, paid an enormous unacknowledged price for a war it never joined. The interwar years that followed were, by comparison, almost boring, which, after everything else, Norway had earned. There was a Great Depression to get through, hitting fishing and shipping particularly hard, and a growing labour movement finding its political feet. Mostly there was a small Scandinavian country minding its own business, while the rest of Europe rearmed with an enthusiasm that should have worried everyone. Norway declared neutrality again the moment war broke out in 1939, on the assumption it had worked out fine last time. It had not accounted for one detail. This time, the country doing the invading wasn't going to be talked out of it by anyone's workers' movement, and Norway wasn't just a shipping lane in someone else's war. It was real estate. On the 9th of April, 1940, Germany invaded. Neutral Norway was not neutral to Adolf Hitler at all. It was strategically priceless, because Swedish iron ore, essential to German weapons production, had to travel through Norwegian waters once the Baltic froze over, and because Norway's long Atlantic coastline offered naval bases that could threaten British shipping for the rest of the war. German forces struck simultaneously at ports across the country in one of the more audacious amphibious operations in military history, codenamed Operation Weserübung. Denmark fell in hours. Norway, to Germany's genuine surprise, did not. Outside Oslo, at Oscarsborg Fortress, decades-old coastal guns, relics of an earlier war, entirely opened fire on the German cruiser Blücher as it steamed up the fjord and sank it, killing hundreds of German troops aboard. It bought Norway's government just enough time to get out of the capital before the Germans arrived. That head start mattered enormously, because what happened next defined the occupation. The Germans demanded King Håkon the Fourth formally appoint a collaborator government led by a Norwegian army officer and fringe politician named Vidkun Quisling, who had already tried to seize power himself in a radio broadcast the very day of the invasion. Håkon refused, flatly, even with German bombers actively hunting him through the countryside. He and the government kept moving north for 2 months before boarding a British warship for London that June, where they spent the rest of the war running a government in exile and quietly keeping Norway's merchant fleet working for the Allies. Quisling was eventually installed as a puppet minister-president, deeply unpopular even among Norwegian fascists, ruling a country that despised him. And here's the detail that outlived the war itself. Within months of the invasion, Quisling had already entered the English language as a plain noun for a traitor. He turned his own surname into an insult before his war was even over. Occupied Norway did not sit quietly through this. A secret resistance organisation called Milorg grew, cell by cell, from stubborn amateurs into an underground force roughly 40,000 strong by war's end, working with British intelligence to prepare for the day the Allies finally arrived. And out of the fishing villages on Norway's west coast came something almost cinematic. Small fishing boats, crewed largely by teenagers and men in their 20s, that spent 4 years crossing one of the roughest stretches of open water in Europe to reach the Shetland Islands and back. They smuggled weapons, radios and agents in, and smuggled refugees and resistance fighters out, over 100 trips in total. It became known simply as the Shetland Bus, a wonderfully understated name for an operation that regularly gambled entire crews against the North Sea in winter, in the dark, with the Luftwaffe watching the coastline. But if you want the single wildest story out of occupied Norway, It's what happened at a hydroelectric plant near a town called Rjukan. That plant, Vemork, was the only facility on the planet producing something called heavy water in industrial quantities, a substance the Allies believed Nazi Germany needed for its nuclear weapons research. So, on a February night in 1943, 9 Norwegian commandos dropped by parachute into a frozen wilderness, skied for miles through waist-deep snow, climbed down and back up a near-vertical gorge to avoid the guarded bridge, broke into the plant, planted charges on the production cells, and got out again without firing a single shot on either side. It destroyed the entire heavy water stockpile and set the German program back substantially. Historians still argue how close Germany actually was to a bomb. Nobody argues about how good that mission was. The occupation dragged on 2 more grinding years, rationing, deportations, executions of resistance members, a population surviving on very little and saying even less to strangers. Then, on the 8th of May, 1945, Germany surrendered, and Norway's occupation ended with the rest of the war in Europe. King Håkon the Fourth sailed back into Oslo harbour on the 7th of June, 5 years, to the day after he'd sailed away from it. Vidkun Quisling was arrested within days, tried for treason through the autumn, found guilty, and executed by firing squad on the 24th of October, 1945, the only Norwegian head of government, puppet or otherwise, ever put to death by his own country. So Norway came out the other side of the 20th century's first half, battered, hungry, and short several thousand sailors and resistance fighters it would never get back, but unmistakably, defiantly intact. It had walked out of one union by referendum and out of an occupation by outlasting it, which, if you're keeping score, is 2 separate great powers that underestimated a small, stubborn country inside 40 years. There was a capital to rebuild, an economy to restart from close to zero, and a whole generation that had grown up either fighting or hiding. Nobody standing in Oslo that June morning had the faintest idea what was sitting under the seabed a few hundred kilometres off their own coast waiting. That's a story for later. For now, Norway just wanted to go home, turn the lights back on, and finally get some sleep. Chapter 6. The country that got lucky and didn't blow it. Home, lights on, some sleep. That was the plan. What actually followed was several years of ration books, for a country that had just spent 5 years being occupied and was in no mood to be told butter was still complicated. Bridges were down. The merchant fleet, once the 4th largest on Earth, had lost a huge chunk of its ships to the war and needed rebuilding practically from the keel up. So Norway did the least cinematic thing imaginable after a heroic resistance and a king's triumphant return. It got a government job. Marshall Plan money came in from the United States starting in 1948, and Norwegians poured it and their own labour into hydroelectric dams, shipyards, and a welfare system that promised something genuinely new, that if illness or bad luck knocked you flat, the state would actually catch you. Not glamorous. Just the unglamorous work that turns a battered country back into a functioning one. One dam, one shipyard, one dreary committee meeting at a time. Nobody writes ballads about committee meetings. They should. Committees are what actually rebuild a country. Long after the parades for the soldiers have wrapped up and everyone's gone back to figuring out plumbing. Somewhere in the middle of all that concrete pouring, Norway also made a decision that would have stunned every Norwegian king going back to Harald Fairhair. In 1949, it joined NATO as a founding member, a formal military alliance with other countries, permanently in peacetime. This is a country that had spent 900 years perfecting the art of staying out of other people's business, right up until a German invasion demonstrated, rather forcefully, that neutrality is only a strategy if the other guy respects it, so Norway picked a side. It just quietly decided it would rather have friends with tanks than a strongly worded letter next time someone showed up uninvited. And yet here's the twist: when Europe started building an actual economic union next door, Norway looked at the invitation twice and said no both times. In 1972, and again in 1994, Norwegians went to the polls to vote on joining the European Union, and both times, by a margin of just over half, they turned it down. Not over money. The economic case was, by most counts, decent. It came down to something more stubborn. A small country that had only recently finished clawing its way out from under other people's crowns really did not feel like signing up for a new one. Even a friendly, well-funded one with excellent trade terms. If Chapter 5 taught you anything about this country, it's that Norway has a type, and the type is, no thank you, we'll manage. Which brings us, finally, to the part of this story where geography stops being scenic and starts being extremely profitable. Through the 1960s, oil companies were creeping into the North Sea, a stretch of water so famously miserable brutal storms, freezing temperatures, seabed a mess to drill through that most geologists assumed there was nothing down there worth the trouble. An American company called Phillips Petroleum had been drilling dry hole after dry hole off the Norwegian coast for years, and was, by 1969, thoroughly done. Company records show they seriously considered packing it in entirely. The only reason they didn't is almost funny. Their license required one more well, and skipping it meant paying a fine. Phillips did the math, decided drilling was cheaper than the penalty, and reluctantly sank one more hole into the seabed purely to avoid a paperwork charge. That well found Ekofisk, struck on the 25th of October, 1969. It turned out to be one of the largest offshore oil fields ever discovered anywhere on the planet found. Essentially, out of pure spite toward a licensing fee, Norwegian officials got the news just before Christmas that year, and locals still call it the Christmas surprise, which might be the most Scandinavian possible name for a geological event that would eventually be worth trillions of dollars. Picture the scale of this for a moment. A country of a few million people, mostly farmers and fishermen a generation removed from wartime rationing, had just discovered it was sitting on an entire alternate economy underneath a stretch of ocean everyone had written off as a maritime nightmare. Most countries would have lost their minds. Norway, characteristically, formed a committee. That committee turned out to be the single smartest decision this country ever made, and here's why it matters. Almost every nation that stumbles into sudden resource wealth ends up worse for it. Economists even have a name for it, the resource curse, where oil money floods in, currencies spike, corruption follows, and everything except oil quietly withers. Norway looked at that pattern and, essentially, opted out. It created a state oil company. Statoil kept firm public ownership over the fields and taxed petroleum profits at rates that would make an American oil executive faint, historically hovering around 3/4 of the profit. The private companies still made plenty of money. The state simply made sure the country that owned the seabed got the lion's share of what came out of it. Wild concept, taxing your own natural resources for your own people's benefit. Somebody should really try that more often. It helped that Norway wrote the rules down early and stuck to them. A document Norwegians still half-jokingly call the 10 Oil Commandments, a bureaucratic memo that somehow functioned like scripture for the next 50 years of national policy. But taxing the oil was only half the plan. because the other classic mistake resource-rich countries make is spending the windfall the moment it arrives. New roads, new subsidies, a booming economy that inflates like a balloon and pops the second prices drop. So in 1990, Norway did something almost aggressively boring. It created a savings account. The Government Petroleum Fund, later renamed the Government Pension Fund Global, took the first deposit in 1996 and has been quietly, relentlessly investing oil revenue in stocks and bonds all over the world ever since. Under a rule so strict it borders on masochistic, the government may only spend the fund's expected annual return, never the principal. Imagine winning the lottery and choosing, forever, to live only off the interest. That's the entire national policy. And here's the number that should genuinely stop you mid-yawn. That savings account is now worth more than $2 trillion, making it the largest sovereign wealth fund on the entire planet, spread across more than 7,000 companies in nearly every country on Earth. All told, it owns something like 1.5% of every publicly traded share in the world. 1.5% of literally everything, every company you've heard of, probably a dozen you haven't. Divide that fund by the population and every single Norwegian citizen is, on paper, sitting on somewhere around $400,000 they will never personally see, spend, or brag about at a dinner party. It is, without exaggeration, one of the strangest financial facts on the planet, and it started because an oil company didn't want to pay a fine. All that money bought Norway something harder to put a price on, which is a genuinely enviable standard of living. Free healthcare, heavily subsidized education straight through university, a pension system that doesn't rely on hoping the stock market behaves, and an economy with one of the smallest gaps between rich and poor anywhere in the developed world. Norway spends most years parked at or near the very top of global happiness and quality of life rankings, which, if you think about it, is a genuinely funny outcome for a country that gets roughly 2 months of usable daylight in the winter. Somehow being extremely comfortable, extremely secure, and financially cushioned against catastrophe outweighs several weeks of watching the sun set at 3 in the afternoon. Good information for anyone currently drifting off in the dark themselves. There's a lesson buried in there somewhere about security beating sunshine, but it's late, so we'll just let the Norwegians have this one without further analysis. Of course, there's an obvious tension sitting underneath all that comfort, and Norway knows it. This is a country that markets itself, quite genuinely. As a climate leader, nearly all its own domestic electricity comes from hydropower, and it has some of the highest electric vehicle adoption rates anywhere on Earth, while simultaneously remaining one of the world's largest exporters of the oil and gas that everyone else is burning. It's a bit like being the health-conscious friend who orders a salad and then sells cigarettes out of the trunk of their car. Norwegians argue about this constantly, and not quietly. It's one of the country's most contested political fault lines, a genuinely uncomfortable question with no clean answer, and to their credit, nobody there pretends the contradiction isn't sitting right there in plain sight. Not everything about modern Norway is spreadsheets and clean energy, though, and the country's most painful modern chapter deserves to be told straight, without the jokes. On the 22nd of July, 2011, a right-wing extremist detonated a car bomb in central Oslo, then travelled to the island of Utøya, where the governing party's youth wing was holding its annual summer camp, and opened fire on teenagers for over an hour. 77 people were killed that day, most of them very young. It remains the deadliest attack on Norwegian soil since the Second World War, and it happened not from an invading army but from one of their own. What Norway did next says more about the country than almost anything else in this whole series. There was no push for the death penalty. Norway doesn't have one, and didn't add one, The maximum sentence handed down was 21 years, extendable if the courts still consider him dangerous, a legal ceiling most nations would find almost insultingly lenient. And rather than tightening into fear, the Prime Minister at the time stood up and said the country's answer to hatred and violence would be more democracy, more openness, not less. Hundreds of thousands of people filled the streets of Oslo carrying roses, a country grieving in public and refusing, deliberately and stubbornly, to let one man's violence rewrite who they were. That's not a punchline. It's just who they decided to be, on the worst day in their modern history. Zoom out from Oslo and there's one more community worth a moment, because we've spent 5 chapters talking about Norwegians without mentioning that the far north of this country was never entirely Norwegian to begin with. The Sami, an indigenous people who have herded reindeer across the Arctic stretches of Norway, Sweden, Finland and Russia for well over 1,000 years, spent much of the 19th and 20th centuries on the receiving end of an official government policy, literally named Norwegianization, banning their language in schools, pressuring assimilation, quietly trying to erase a culture that had been up there longer than the Norwegian state itself. Norway finally established a Sami parliament in 1989 and has spent the decades since slowly, imperfectly, working out what genuine recognition looks like. Reindeer herders are still fighting land disputes today, wind farms included. Old grievances, it turns out, don't come with an expiration date, and there's something worth sitting with in the fact that this entire chapter, all of it, the oil, the fund, the referendums, the tidy welfare state, happened almost entirely in the southern 2/3 of a country whose northern reaches belong, culturally and historically, to someone else's story too. So here's where we leave Norway. A sliver of coastline and mountain that spent its early centuries producing exactly 2 things in any real quantity: fish and extremely motivated raiders before Christianity. Plague, foreign kings, and 2 world wars took turns, knocking it around for the better part of 1,000 years. By any reasonable historical odds, this should be a minor, damp footnote of a country, remembered mostly for scenery and an unreasonable number of fjords. Instead, it clawed its way to independence twice, outlasted an occupation that was supposed to break it, and then got extraordinarily lucky under an ocean nobody trusted. And when that luck arrived, it did the single least Norwegian-sounding thing possible, with it throwing a party followed immediately by the single most Norwegian-sounding thing possible, which was to save every last krone of it, all of it, just in case. There's something almost absurdly fitting about that ending, if you think back to where this whole story started. A hard, narrow, unforgiving strip of land taught its people patience out of necessity, back before anyone had heard of oil, or unions, or committees. And centuries later, when the ground finally handed them a fortune, patience is exactly what they used to keep it. Not a bad note to end on, honestly. Somewhere out past Oslo right now, the fjords are doing what they've always done, sitting there, dark and quiet and enormous, entirely unbothered by how the story turned out. Which, all things considered, seems like a fine way to leave them, and a fine place, at last, to close your eyes